I used to believe that hell was a place far away, a fiery punishment reserved for the wicked. But as I sit here now, 61 years old, I know better. Hell can be a dinner table where your chair is quietly pushed back until you're no longer part of the picture. Hell can be a house full of laughter that no longer has a place for your voice. Hell, I discovered, can be built by the hands of those you love most. My name is Caroline, and for decades I tried to be a good wife, a good mother, a good daughter. I worked until my hands shook, cooked until my back ached, and bent myself into shapes that pleased everyone but me. I thought love was earned by sacrifice, that if I gave enough, if I stayed quiet, if I kept forgiving, someone would notice. Someone would choose me. I was wrong. The first time I met Julia, I wanted to believe she was an answer to my prayers. My son Matthew brought her home one bright Sunday morning, carrying that kind of smile I hadn't seen on his face since he was a boy clutching a toy truck. Julia had that kind of presence that filled a room before her voice even did. Her auburn hair shimmered in the sunlight pouring through the kitchen window. Her laugh had a musical lilt to it, and when she reached for Matthew's hand, she made it look effortless, as if the two of them had been written into the same sentence. I stood at the stove, plating roast chicken and collard greens, the dishes Matthew always loved. For a fleeting moment, my heart softened. Maybe she would be good for him. Maybe she would love him in the ways I had failed to. But as I carried the dishes to the table and watched Matthew's eyes flick to hers for approval before he even touched his fork, something inside me tightened. It was the way she tilted her head and laughed at David's jokes as if she had always belonged. The way she studied me without appearing to, as though she were measuring what needed replacing. David adored her from the start. He poured her wine, complimented her smile, told her, "Julia, you make Matthew glow. Haven't seen him this happy in years." His praise landed like an insult, as though my decades of devotion had never managed to create the same glow. I smiled politely, but in my chest, something burned. Weeks turned into months, and our home shifted around Julia like it had always been waiting for her. She brought gifts for David, tidied up the kitchen after meals as though rehearsing ownership, and laughed off my stories mid-sentence. Matthew became less my son and more her shadow. His laughter belonged to her now. His gratitude bent toward her. His loyalty trained on her approval. The first real crack came when my health faltered. It started as a cough, then weight pressing on my chest, then nights where sleep was shallow and breath came ragged. I delayed going to the doctor. Mothers do that. We delay for everyone else until finally my body forced me. The diagnosis was grim but not fatal, a chronic lung condition, manageable with rest and care. "You must take it easy," the doctor said. "Avoid stress. Conserve your strength." Rest. I had never known what that word meant. Rest was something other people could afford, not me. But I tried. I asked Matthew and Julia for help just for a while, until I could breathe freely again. I thought they'd rally. Thought my son would remember the nights I sat beside him when fever racked his little body, the mornings I held his trembling hand on the way to school. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, voice steady but soft, and said, "I need help with the house, just for a bit." Matthew frowned, concern flickering in his eyes, but Julia was quicker. She pressed his hand, smiled, and said gently, "Maybe it's time you thought about moving somewhere easier. A place with nurses, where you can be comfortable." My heart sank. My house. My mother's quilt still on the bed. My wedding china tucked into cabinets. My memories in every wall was suddenly being discussed like a burden. I looked to Matthew, praying for him to protest, but he nodded, as if the thought had already lived in his mind. It might be best. "Mom," he said, and David, my husband of 40 years, said nothing. He stared at his plate like the scrambled eggs might shield him from me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to pound the table and remind them all who I was, what I had given. But the words died in my throat, smothered by disbelief. That night, I wandered the house alone, running my fingers over the photographs that still hung, the worn grooves of the banister I polished for decades, the quilt stitched by my mother's hands. I wept until my chest burned. Soon after, Julia began changing the house more openly. She rearranged furniture, replaced family photographs with abstract art, moved my mother's quilt into storage. The silver frame that held my favorite photo of my parents disappeared. "It was cracked," Julia said with a careless shrug. I never saw it again. Little by little, pieces of me were erased. When the day came that I left for the care facility, I packed only a suitcase. I paused at the doorway, looking back at the home I had built, at the family I had held together through illness and debts and nights of despair. I expected grief. What I felt instead was something colder, a sense of being discarded, like a dress gone out of fashion. The facility was sterile and quiet, walls too white, silence too heavy. I spent the first days staring out of the window, wondering how my life had narrowed to this. I was alive, but it felt like being buried early. And yet, silence has a strange way of sharpening the mind. Alone in that room, I began to remember. Whispers of old conversations floated back, David laughing with his brother about keeping things quiet, Matthew being shielded from unnecessary truths, Julia mentioning her mother's job at the bank years ago. Threads began to tangle into something darker. It was a young nurse, Elena, who stirred me from despair. She had kind eyes and a voice that carried truth. One evening, as she checked my vitals, she paused and asked, "Why are you here?" "Caroline, you have a family. Why are you alone?" Her words cut through me. Why was I here? Because I was sick, or because it was easier for them without me, for the first time? I admitted the truth. Even to myself, they hadn't just forgotten me. They had pushed me out. That night, I pulled out a notebook and began writing. I wrote every memory I could dredge up the missing frame. The bank papers I never fully understood. The laughter behind closed doors. I wrote until my hand cramped, until the paper blurred with tears. It was as if by writing, I was reattaching myself to the world they had cut me out of. And then, one morning, a man appeared at my door. He introduced himself as Franklin, a private investigator. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "I believe it's time you learned the truth about what's happening in your family." He laid a folder on my lap. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were bank statements, property deeds, copies of documents I had never seen. The house I thought belonged to David and me had quietly shifted hands. Some accounts listed Matthew and Julia as beneficiaries. Transfers traced back to Julia's mother, who had once worked at the very bank where my own mother's estate had been processed. Pages of evidence formed a trail of betrayal stretching back decades. I sat frozen, the paper heavy in my hands. Julia hadn't just stumbled into our lives. She had been guided, prepared, ushered into my family with precision. She was not merely my son's wife. She was part of a plan. In that moment, grief turned to rage. They thought I was weak, invisible, buried in a white room with nothing left. They were wrong. I had survived too much, held too much, to let them write the ending of my story. For the first time in years, I felt fire in my chest, not sickness, but resolve. Franklin returned 2 days later, this time with more than papers. He brought me my own memories, refracted through evidence I had never seen. He sat quietly across from me, his eyes kind but steady, and slid another folder toward me. "This may be harder than the first," he warned. Inside were hospital records from the week I gave birth to Matthew. My vision blurred as I scanned the pages. Notes in clinical language complications, extended sedation, restricted visitors. Attached to the file was a form I didn't recognize, a private adoption agreement, never filed publicly. David's signature scrawled on the line marked guardian. My heart began to pound. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice catching on each syllable. "I carried him. I remember." But even as I spoke, another memory bubbled up from the fog, those strange weeks after Matthew's birth, when I was so weak, so foggy, when David insisted on handling everything, the way he shushed my questions, the way visitors were turned away, how quickly Matthew was placed in my arms, and how I never saw a single official form. Franklin didn't push. "You raised him," he said gently. "That's undeniable, but according to these records." David arranged for a private placement through a connection at the hospital. Julia's mother worked there at the time. The room tilted, and I gripped the armrests of my chair. It felt as though someone had reached inside me and torn out the foundation of my life. My son, my boy, whom I had rocked through fevers, whose first steps I had cheered, was not mine by blood. And the woman who now sat smugly in my home had been linked to him before he even entered my arms. Tears spilled down my face, hot and endless. "They planned this," I murmured. Even then, the enormity of it pressed against my lungs until I could hardly breathe. Franklin stayed silent, giving me space to drown and then surface. That night, I wandered the sterile halls of the facility like a ghost, clutching the folder to my chest. Everything I had believed about my marriage, my motherhood, my sacrifices felt like a cruel performance staged for an audience I didn't know existed. My body was sick, but my spirit felt poisoned. Elena found me in the lounge, staring at the rain sliding down the windows. She didn't ask questions. She simply handed me a cup of tea and sat. After a long silence, she said, "They took much from you, but they cannot erase what you gave. You loved him. You raised him. That is real." Her words landed like stones in a pond, sending ripples through my grief. Could love be real even if its origins were built on a lie? Could motherhood be defined by choice rather than blood? The pain was still sharp, but beneath it, something began to harden, not bitterness, but resolve. I began to plan, not for revenge in the way movies show it, but for truth, for reclaiming my name, my mother's name, my story. Franklin agreed to help me, together. We mapped out the evidence bank transfers, property deeds, hospital records, even the missing heirlooms. We prepared a case not for money, but for clarity. Weeks passed. My body weakened, but my mind sharpened. Each night I wrote in my notebook, not just facts, but memories, the smell of Matthew's hair after a bath, the feel of David's hand when it was still tender, the sound of my mother's sewing machine. I wrote it all, as though weaving a net to catch what had been stolen. When Franklin told me we had enough to request a formal hearing, a flicker of fear crossed me. Facing them would mean exposing everything, even the secret of Matthew's birth. But hiding had cost me too much already. "Do it," I said. "I want it all on record." The day of the hearing, the sky outside was a brittle blue, the kind of color that feels like it could shatter if you touched it. I wore a simple dress and held my notebook like a talisman. Elena hugged me before I left, whispering, "You are stronger than you know." At the courthouse, Franklin guided me through the halls. My legs trembled but held. When we entered the chamber, I saw them all at once: Julia in a pale beige dress, her hair glossy and arranged just so. David sitting stiffly beside her, older but still clinging to his pride. Matthew hovering behind them, eyes darting between me and the floor. My heart clenched. He was still my boy, no matter what the paper said, but he had stood by silently while I was pushed out. That silence hurt more than any signature. The judge began the session. Franklin presented the documents in steady order, the transfers of my mother's estate through accounts tied to David, the signature of Julia's mother at the bank. The property deed quietly shifted from my name to theirs. Then came the hospital records. The courtroom air seemed to contract as the adoption agreement was read aloud. I kept my gaze fixed on a point beyond them, breathing slowly. I would not cry here. I would not give them that. Julia's face paled, but she did not look at me. David's jaw tightened. Matthew's shoulders hunched as if under a weight. When the judge asked if I wanted to speak, I rose. My knees shook, but my voice did not. "I am not here for vengeance," I began. "I am here for my name, for my mother's name, for the truth that was buried while I was told to rest. I built my family brick by brick, meal by meal, sacrifice by sacrifice. You may have taken my house, my inheritance, even my bloodline, but you cannot erase what I gave. Love is not a signature on a form. Love is a life lived. And today, I am putting that life back into the record." Silence settled over the room. For a moment, even Julia's mask cracked, a flicker of something fear-guilt crossing her eyes. The judge ordered further investigation, temporarily freezing certain assets and requiring the return of items traced back to my mother's estate. It wasn't a final victory, but it was the first time in years I felt like I existed again on paper. Not just in memory. Afterward, in the corridor, Julia approached me. Her voice was low but sharp. "You won't win. Caroline, you're too weak. This will destroy you." I met her eyes and, for the first time, saw past the gloss. Beneath her confidence was a tremor. "I don't need to win," I said quietly. "I only need the truth to stand, and you can't stop that." Her lips tightened. She turned away. David pretended not to hear. Matthew stood a few steps behind them, looking at me as though he might speak. But no words came. He just lowered his head. Back at the facility that night, I sat by the window, the court order in my hand. Outside, the sky was dark, but a single streetlight glowed. I thought about my mother, about the quilt Julia had packed away, about the frame sold to a stranger. Pieces of me scattered like seeds, but seeds can grow. Franklin called to tell me they had traced the silver frame to a shop downtown. "We can recover it," he said. "It's small, but it's something." I closed my eyes and let a single tear slide down. Small. Yes. But in that smallness was the start of something large, a reclaiming not just of things, but of self. I began to picture my return not to the house, but to myself. I would face them again, not as the frail woman they exiled, but as the woman who built them and now stood outside their walls. Franklin picked me up the next morning, and for the first time in a long time, I stepped into the day with purpose rather than dread. The city felt different from the passenger seat of his car. Not hostile or indifferent, but full of doors that might open if I dared to knock. We parked near a narrow street where the shops still hand-lettered their windows, and the bell above every door announced a life coming or going. I felt small in my wool coat, breath catching in the cool air. But I followed him into the antique store without asking for his arm. The owner, a woman with ink-stained fingers, recognized the photograph Franklin held out. She glanced at me, at the way my hands shook when he set the print of my mother's silver frame on the glass counter, and she softened. "It came through a consignment 2 months ago," she said. "Sold the same afternoon, when Franklin asked for the paperwork." She hesitated only a second before opening a drawer and producing a thin file. My eyes snagged on a signature that looked uncomfortably familiar, one of Julia's cousins. It was a slender, angled flourish I had seen on gift tags at Christmas. The woman agreed to contact the buyer. "Some people return items when they learn the story behind them," she said, "especially something like this." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe in people who would understand what a frame could hold beyond a picture. We walked out with a copy of the bill of sale and an uneasy hope. Franklin tucked the paper into his folder and patted the top as if to reassure me. "Small stones can start avalanches," he said. "This helps us show a pattern." A gust of wind lifted my scarf, and I tightened it beneath my chin. I closed my eyes and saw my mother's hands again, the way her knuckles swelled from years at the mill, the way she polished that frame with the hem of her apron as if it were a window back into a kinder time. A lump rose in my throat. For once, I did not swallow it down. Back at the facility, Elena was waiting for me in the hallway, hands tucked into the pockets of her scrubs. "How did it go?" she asked. I told her about the signature, about the shop owner's promise to try. Elena's smile was small and fierce. "You're stitching yourself back together," she said, "bit by bit." That night, I slept through without waking to count the seconds between breaths. In the morning, the mirror still showed an older woman, but her shoulders were not slumped under invisible weight. She stood there and met my eyes as if she and I were equal partners at last. The next hearing came quickly. The court moved faster than I expected, perhaps because the papers were so cleanly damning, perhaps because our case was not about winning everything in one blow, but about forcing the first legal recognition that something had gone wrong. As I stepped into the courthouse, I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Julia wore pearl earrings as if to remind the room of her polish. David brushed a sleeve already free of dust. Matthew's jaw was clenched so hard I worried for his teeth. I wanted to reach out to him the way I used to when he woke from nightmares. But there are thresholds even a mother cannot cross once they have been bricked up by choices. Franklin presented the consignment record alongside the bank trails. The judge's eyes moved back and forth, a metronome of attention, when asked to respond. David leaned toward the microphone with that old, tired authority. He said the transactions were housekeeping, that he had only ever acted to protect the family. "Caroline was unwell," he said. The word unwell stretched long enough to cover any sin. She couldn't handle the stress. The judge asked why. Then, no documentation of my consent. Not even a note. David faltered, turning to the attorney he had hired. The attorney spoke instead, a smooth voice that had perfected the art of saying nothing as if it were something. It was Julia who broke the script first. "You're all acting like we stole," she said, and her composure finally showed its seam. "But families move things around all the time. The frame was tacky. The house needed updating. We were making room for a life that actually worked." She stopped, realizing too late she had said it exactly as she felt it. The judge lifted a brow. I didn't have to say a word. The sentence sat there between us like a confession. After the session, Franklin and I waited in a quiet alcove near the vending machines. My legs were shaky. The adrenaline that had braced me was receding, leaving behind the ache of the body that had carried it. I was leaning against the cool stone wall when Matthew approached, hands stuffed into his pockets as if he could hide his fingers' tremor. He looked older than he should at his age, like a boy who learned the cost of adulthood too quickly and far too late. "Mom," he said, and the word flew out of him as if it had gone feral in his mouth and found its way back on instinct. I looked at his face and saw both the baby I'd rocked and the man who had watched me leave with only a suitcase. He swallowed. "I didn't know everything." He paused, searching my eyes for a door that might still open, but I knew enough to ask more questions. I didn't. "I'm sorry." I wanted to say that sorry is a small word for a long wound, and yet it is often the only word we have. Instead, I nodded. "It's a start," I said. He nodded back, a little too quickly, like a boy grateful not to be punished. Then Julia called his name from the far end of the hall, an edge in her voice as sharp as a snapped twig. He flinched and went. 2 days later, a plain white envelope appeared in my facility mailbox. The return address was blank. Inside was a single page typed without flair. "Look deeper into David's dealings with the Avery account. Ask for the audit trail from the year your mother died." I stared at the words until they blurred, then handed the paper to Franklin. He didn't look surprised. "Sometimes guilt writes notes," he said. "Sometimes fear does." He filed the request with the bank, and while we waited, we followed a different line, Julia's mother's employment history. The hospital records confirmed she had worked in neonatal administration during the year of Matthew's birth. There were no smoking guns, but there were footprints, a sign-in log on a day my visitors were restricted, a memo about policy exceptions for private family matters. Each piece was small, but grief is an archaeologist. It knows how to brush away the dust until something recognizable surfaces. The antique shop called. The buyer of the silver frame had agreed to return it, no refund requested. Only the request that I tell them the story when I was ready. I stood in the store with the frame in my hands and cried a different kind of tear. One that tasted less like salt and more like water after a long thirst. Back at my room, I set the frame on the dresser and slid a copy of my parents' photograph inside. Their young faces softened by the decades, but still steady. Elena came in and stood with me looking at it. "There," she said, "back where it belongs." I had not realized how loud the silence was until that moment when it quieted. The bank answer arrived in a brown envelope thicker than it needed to be. Franklin and I unfolded page after page at the small table in my room. The audit trail from the year my mother died showed an anomaly that only a careful eye would catch. An emergency power of attorney executed and revoked within days. Then executed again with corrected language, allowing David to move funds for urgent family medical reasons. I was healthy that week. The only medical crisis belonged to paperwork. The Avery account was a holding account for cross-branch transfers, typically used briefly and then emptied. Money from my mother's estate rested there for precisely 48 hours before landing under David's control, then dripped out through small withdrawals and household improvements over the following months. It wasn't just one theft. It was a quiet siphon, a long straw in a bottle I didn't know was at my table. We presented this at the next hearing. The judge's questions turned pointed. Why temporary execution and revocation, he asked. The attorney answered air. David stared fixedly at the wood grain of the table. A man pretending the surface might offer a different future if he memorized it. Julia sat with her legs crossed and her mouth pressed thin. Matthew, to his credit, did not look away this time. He watched me. It is a strange thing to be watched by your child, as though you are the one who might save him from drowning, when you know he is the one who loosened the rope. It is stranger still to feel the tug of that old instinct that says, swim to him anyway. Between sessions, I found myself walking longer loops around the facility's courtyard. My breath still ran short on cold mornings, but it ran honest. I no longer tried to make my lungs do what they could not. I held them until they steadied, the way I once held Matthew through fevers. Elena began leaving little notes in my notebook, 3 or 4 words. Keep going. Caroline, you're almost there. The kindness felt like stitches, closing a wound that had been left open too long to heal cleanly. One evening, the phone rang in my room, and I knew, by the particular mixture of dread and hope in my chest, that it would be Matthew. He began with apologies that tumbled over one another until they lost shape, then fell silent, as if he had finally run out of excuses to hide inside. She told me you were better off there, he said, his voice raw, that you were tired, that we were helping. I was too tired to be enraged. I was also too awake to soothe him. Help, I said softly, is a verb that touches the person it claims to serve. It doesn't push them out of their own life. He didn't argue. If I come by tomorrow, he asked, will you see me? I considered saying no, letting the ache in my chest answer for me. But I also remembered the boy who used to carry the grocery bag with both arms and 2 proud feet. The boy who once stood in the door of my room after a nightmare and asked if I was still there. Come, I said, but come as yourself. He arrived the next afternoon, alone. He looked like someone who had put down a heavy thing and wasn't sure how to stand without it. He sat at the edge of the chair, elbows on knees, and told me what I had already suspected and what still hurt to hear, that Julia's mother had introduced them at a community fundraiser because she knew he came from a good family, that he had felt chosen for the first time in a long time, that when Julia said we, it felt like membership in a world that wasn't always waiting for him to prove he deserved it. I listened, not because I owed him absolution, but because both of us deserved the truth aloud. When he finished, he looked at the silver frame on my dresser and covered his face with his hands. I don't know who I am without them, he said. I could have said, you are the boy who liked buttered corn and divided his cookie to give me the bigger half. Instead, I said, then this is your work now, not mine. The final hearing date was set. I marked it in my notebook and slept with the book under my pillow, like a child placing a tooth for a kindly thief. I did not dream. The morning arrived clear and brittle again, the cold like a clean blade. Franklin met me at the courthouse steps. We did not speak much. Words felt like currency I needed to spend only when necessary. Inside, the courtroom held its usual smell of paper and polish. The judge entered. We stood. We began with the audit trail. Then the adoption documents surfaced in sequence, their edges innocently square around the cruelty that had been tucked into them. The judge asked me if I wished to keep certain details sealed. I glanced at Matthew and shook my head. Secrets had escorted us to this room. They would not see us out. When the papers were read, something visible left David's shoulders, as if the spirit that had steadied his justifications had finally grown tired of holding them up. Julia stared straight ahead, her lashes unmoving. For an instant, a breath. Nothing more. I saw the lonely child inside the poised woman, the one who had learned early that control could be love's counterfeit. Pity and justice crossed paths inside me and did not touch. My statement that day was shorter than before. I said that restitution mattered, that names belonged on what they built, and that mine had been scraped off. I said that if there were criminal considerations, I would not stand in the way of the law. I said, mostly to myself, that I was done curating other people's comfort around my pain. The judge nodded. He began to read his orders: assets frozen pending distribution, return of items traced to my mother's estate, a formal inquiry into the hospital irregularities, and a recommendation for mediation regarding the house. I didn't hear the rest. In the space between his words and my heartbeat, I felt something unfasten. Not triumph, not relief, but a loosening of the knot that had held my breath hostage for years. After the gavel, I turned to leave and found Matthew standing. He didn't reach for me. He stepped aside, giving me the right of way. I walked past him, past Julia's fixed stare, past David's sagging pride, and into the corridor where the winter light fell in careful squares on the floor. Franklin joined me and we moved together toward the doors as if we had practiced this exit for a lifetime. Outside, the air was crisp enough to bite. I lifted my face to it and let the cold make my eyes water without shame. The sky above the courthouse was pale and streaked with the faintest pink, like a scar that had learned to be beautiful. I held my notebook to my chest, felt the reassuring rectangle of it, and realized I no longer needed to write every breath down to prove I existed. I could breathe. I could go home, not to the house that had expelled me, but to the small, solid place inside myself that had waited patiently through every exile. The morning after the judgment, I woke to find sunlight spilling across the frame on my dresser. My mother's photograph looked almost alive in the soft light, her eyes steady as though she were watching me, as though she had been present in every word I had spoken in that courtroom. For the first time in many years, I did not feel invisible. The truth was recorded, spoken aloud, written down where no one could erase it. It did not mend the decades I had lost, but it restored something deeper: my name, my dignity, my place in the story of my own family. Matthew came again, this time with no apologies rehearsed. No excuses folded into neat packages. He sat in the chair across from me, his hands restless, his eyes swollen from nights without sleep. I listened. "Mom," he said, when they read those papers. I wanted to vanish. I wanted to deny it. But I couldn't. I knew, even before I walked into that courtroom, that something was wrong, and I let it happen anyway. His voice broke on the last word, as though it was heavier than all the rest. I watched him, my son, my not son, my child in every way that mattered, and yet not by blood. The revelation of his adoption still burned in me like a raw wound, but seeing him there, broken open, I understood something. Love is not undone by a document. What I gave him in lullabies, in hot soup on fever nights, in scolding and laughter and fierce protection that was real. And it was mine to keep, no matter what the hospital files claimed. I don't know who I am anymore, he whispered. I leaned forward, my hand trembling but steady enough to touch his. Then learn, I said. Learn without her voice in your ear. Learn without your father's shadow. You don't need me to tell you who you are. But if you choose to find out, know this, I will not close my door to you. Not this time. He nodded, tears sliding unchecked down his face. He left soon after, and I did not ask where he was going. Sometimes the beginning of healing is not a long embrace, but the chance to walk away with the truth in your pocket. Julia never came to see me, but word reached me through Franklin that she had left town for a while. Her name whispered now in connection with fraud investigations tied to her mother's years at the hospital. The walls she had built of charm and control were crumbling, and she was learning what I had always known secrets wrought when exposed to air. David, too, faced consequences. The inquiry into my mother's estate had unearthed enough irregularities that the bank was forced to cooperate with legal authorities. My husband of 40 years, the man who had once held me on our wedding night with promises of forever, now sat in the glare of suspicion. And yet, when I thought of him, I did not feel triumph. I felt sorrow for the man he had chosen to become, for the way greed had carved him into a stranger. I had loved him once, fiercely, and that love had built a life that sheltered our child. To watch him crumble now was not satisfying. It was simply the last confirmation of what I had already lost long ago. I moved out of the care facility in the spring, with the partial restitution granted by the court. I rented a modest cottage at the edge of town. It had a small porch where I could sit with tea and watch the trees shift in the wind. Elena helped me move, carrying boxes and laughing when she dropped a lamp. She came often after that, bringing flowers, sitting quietly with me as if she knew that silence, when shared, could be healing. Franklin visited too, delivering updates until the last threads of the case were tied. On his final visit, he handed me a neatly bound folder. Everything is here, he said. The truth, in black and white. It belongs to you now. I placed the folder on the shelf beside the silver frame, not out of pride, but out of completion. That night, I lit a single candle and sat by the window, letting the flame dance in the reflection of the glass. I thought of my mother, of the quilt folded at the end of my bed, of the photo smiling back at me from the frame. Pieces stolen had been returned. But the greater return was this: I was no longer erased. Matthew came once more, months later. He stood on my porch, hands in his pockets, his face thinner but clearer somehow, as if he had shed a skin. I left her, he said simply. And I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I wanted to try. I invited him inside. We sat at the table where I had set 2 bowls of soup, as though some part of me had known he would come. He ate slowly, and I watched him, not the boy he had been, nor the man who had betrayed me, but something in between, a son, searching for himself. I did not speak forgiveness aloud, because words like that are too heavy to rush. But when he reached for another spoonful, I let my hand rest lightly on the table, close enough for him to know the door was open. Life did not return to what it had been. How could it? Trust, once shattered, does not rebuild into the same shape. But in the quiet of my cottage, in the morning light that warmed my face, I found a peace I had thought impossible. I had been betrayed. Yes, I had been erased, discarded, plotted against. But I had also fought back. I had spoken the truth. And in doing so, I had reclaimed myself. The story did not end with applause or perfect reconciliation. It ended with survival, with dignity, with a woman who chose not to be silenced. It ended with me, Caroline, no longer the ghost in my own life, but the author of its final chapter. And if you are listening to this, if you have ever felt erased in your own home, know this: your story is not over until you decide it is. Secrets can be broken open. Betrayals can be named. And even in the ashes of what you have lost, you can still plant something new. So, if this story has touched you, I ask you from my heart, share it, so that no one else feels alone in their silence. Leave a comment. Tell me what you carry, what you've lost, and what you've found. And if you believe stories like mine matter, then please like, share, and subscribe, so that we can keep shining a light on the truths too many families bury. Because sometimes justice isn't about winning, it's about speaking, it's about surviving, and it's about refusing to disappear.